The galaxy watched through a billion screens as Ambassador Keiko Tanaka knelt on red stone, her silver hair stark against the crimson plaza of Zorvath Prime. She had known this would happen, had accepted it the moment she boarded the diplomatic shuttle with 47 volunteers who understood the stakes as clearly as she did. In the final seconds before Supreme Commander Krath'zul raised his ceremonial blade, heated to temperatures that would turn human flesh to ash on contact, Tanaka's last coherent thought was not of fear, but of failure. 300 years of human diplomacy, and they had never made the Zorvath understand the difference between choosing peace and being incapable of war. The broadcast lasted 47 minutes. Long enough for Admiral Marcus Thorne to watch from his quarters aboard the defense station, orbiting New Harmony, his hands gripping the edges of his desk until the metal bent. Long enough for every human in the galaxy to see what became of mercy when offered to those who viewed it as weakness. Long enough for something fundamental to break in the collective human consciousness. Thorne had argued with Tanaka 3 days before she left. They had stood in the observation deck of the Galactic Council station, watching ships come and go through the massive docking arrays, and Thorne had tried one last time to make her see reason. "You know they will kill you," he had said. "They have rejected every overture for 2 years. They broadcast their massacres as entertainment." Tanaka had smiled, tired but resolute. "If I do not go, we prove them right about us. That we only offer peace when it costs us nothing. And if you die," Thorne had pressed. "What does that prove?" "That we tried everything," she had answered quietly. "That when the time comes to do what must be done, no one can say we did not exhaust every alternative." Now Thorne stood before the Emergency Council of Joint Command, 3 kilometers beneath the surface of Earth in a bunker that most of humanity's civilian government did not know existed. 12 officers sat around a steel table, their faces carved from stone, and Thorne saw in their eyes the same thing he felt coiling in his chest like a living serpent. Rage, yes, but also something colder. Permission. General Thorne and Mbatha was 90 years old, a veteran of Earth's final unification wars before the planet had learned to speak with one voice. She had killed enough people to populate a small city, and the weight of those deaths lived in the deep lines of her face. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone who understood exactly what was being proposed. Protocol Sanctuary is suspended for military operations against the Zorvath Dominion, effective immediately. She gestured, and holographic displays filled the room with schematics that Thorne had never seen in his 7 years commanding the human defense fleet. Ships that looked like predators rather than explorers. Weapon systems with names that made his tactical mind simultaneously recoil and calculate optimal deployment patterns. "These are not what we built before Protocol Sanctuary," Mbatha continued. "These are what our civilian technology becomes when we remove the safety limiters we installed to prevent accidents or atrocities." Thorne studied the displays. A medical nanite designed to repair cellular damage at the molecular level, its programming constraints stripped away, its replication rate unrestricted. A mining laser built to crack asteroids, its focus field recalibrated, its power output no longer throttled. A terraforming device that could reshape a planet's atmosphere, its parameters inverted. "We thought we had built a civilization of peace," Mbatha said softly. "We built a civilization that chose not to look at what its tools could do." The silence that followed was broken by Admiral Henrik Volkmar, commander of the Home Fleet, his voice rough with something between grief and anticipation. "Rules of engagement." Thorne found his own voice. "Complete operational authority, no civilian oversight, no council observers, and I want every ship outfitted within 2 weeks." "You have it all," Mbatha confirmed. Then she leaned forward, her ancient eyes fixing on Thorne with an intensity that made him feel like a cadet again. "One thing you need to understand, Admiral. Some of our people have been waiting for this. Some of them have wanted this excuse. Watch for them. Watch yourself. Because what we are about to do will change us, and not all of those changes will be reversible." 3 days later, Thorne stood in Laboratory 7 of the Prometheus Research Station, watching Dr. Yuki Nakamura stare at her life's work with something approaching horror on her face. The medical nanites she had spent 2 decades perfecting floated in a containment field between them, microscopic machines capable of repairing trauma that would have been fatal a century ago. She had won the Galactic Prize for Medicine. She had saved millions of lives. "I designed these to repair tissue," she said, her voice hollow. "You want me to make them consume it?" Thorne understood her revulsion. He shared it. But he also understood that the Zorvath were mobilizing 3 more battle groups to attack human colonies, emboldened by what they saw as proof of human weakness. "We need weapons that can neutralize military targets without destroying civilian infrastructure. Weapons that are precise." Nakamura's laugh was bitter. "Precise? You mean weapons that can distinguish between a Zorvath soldier and a Zorvath child before they eat them both alive?" "I mean weapons that give us options other than orbital bombardment," Thorne said quietly. "I need you to do this, Doctor, because if you do not, someone else will, and they will not share your ethics." She had agreed eventually. They all had. Dr. Nakamura with her medical nanites, Engineer Dmitry Volkov with his mining lasers, astrophysicist Amara Osai with her gravity manipulation systems designed for pushing asteroids, now recalibrated to crush ships into singularities. Each of them looked at their creations with the same expression. The realization that the line between building and destroying was so thin it had never really existed at all. The Zorvath launched their assault on New Harmony 4 days after the modifications were complete. 5 battle groups, 193 ships, advancing on a colony world of 2 billion humans, with the intention of making an example that would break human resistance forever. New Harmony's defense platforms fell back without engaging, just as Thorne had ordered. Evacuation alerts blared across the colony, but civilian transports remained grounded, their passengers terrified and confused as the Zorvath fleet entered the system unopposed. From the bridge of the Indomitable, a ship whose very architecture spoke of predatory purpose, all angular stealth plating and weapon ports that gaped like hungry mouths, Thorne watched the Zorvath advance with the cold clarity of a chess master seeing victory 20 moves ahead. His tactical officer, Commander Pavel Volkov, stood at his station with hands that trembled slightly on the controls. Volkov was Dmitry's younger brother, and he knew exactly what weapons his sibling had created. "All ships," Thorne said into the fleet channel, his voice calm. "Execute Cascade Protocol." The Zorvath fleet ceased to exist in 38 seconds, not destroyed in the clean way of energy weapons that left debris and bodies. The medical nanites, released from human ships in clouds invisible to sensors, infiltrated every vessel simultaneously. They found the Zorvath crew, beings whose biochemistry was well documented from 3 centuries of diplomatic contact, and they did what they were designed to do. They interacted with living tissue, but now, instead of repairing cellular damage, they catalyzed rapid cellular breakdown. The Zorvath warriors died choking on their own dissolving lungs, their scales sloughing off in sheets, their bodies becoming soup inside their armor. It was utterly silent. The Zorvath ships simply went dark, one after another drifting on momentum as their crews died in synchronized agony that lasted less than a minute. No explosions, no dramatic fireballs, just 193 ships becoming crypts, their hulls intact but their interiors transformed into charnel houses. Volkov's face had gone white. "Sir," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "the nanites are self-replicating. They are spreading through the debris field. Any rescue operation would be lethal," Thorne finished. "I know. That is the point. The galaxy needed to see that we could make them disappear, completely. But the galaxy did not see. Not yet, because no Zorvath survived to report what happened. The 5 battle groups simply vanished from all tracking, their last transmissions cutting off mid-word, and the mystery of their disappearance was almost as terrifying as the reality." Supreme Commander Krath'zul watched from Zorvath Prime as his forward elements disappeared from tactical displays. He was not afraid. The Zorvath did not feel fear in the way prey species did, but he was calculating. 5 battle groups represented significant resources. Losing them to an unknown weapon suggested the humans had been hiding capabilities, which implied strategic deception. Deception implied intelligence. He dispatched 2 more battle groups with orders to advance cautiously and report constantly. They vanished in the same way, their transmissions ending in silence. Now Krath'zul felt something like fear, not for himself, but for the fundamental assumption upon which Zorvath civilization was built. That strength was obvious, that warriors recognized other warriors, that the strong took what they wanted and the weak submitted or died. The humans had submitted for 2 years. They had offered peace, offered compromise, offered gifts. This was prey behavior, the behavior of herbivores trying to placate predators. What if it had never been prey behavior at all? The campaign lasted 6 months, and the galaxy watched in growing horror as humanity demonstrated what they had been choosing not to do for 3 centuries. Thorne commanded from the Indomitable as his fleet systematically dismantled every Zorvath military installation across their dominion. But he did not watch from the strategic displays, comfortable in his position of command. He forced himself to observe from ground-level feeds to see what his orders actually meant. On Zorvath Station 7, Lieutenant Jamal Torres led a Marine unit through corridors still hot from the hull breach. They were hunting the station commander, a high-value target who had coordinated raids on human colonies. The Zorvath warriors fought with suicidal ferocity, exactly as expected. What Torres had not expected was the civilians. They found them in a sealed section of the station, 40 Zorvath non-combatants, workers who maintained the station's life support and hydroponics. They huddled together, their scaled bodies pressed against the far wall, their vertical pupils dilated with terror. "Command," Torres said into his comm, his voice tight. "We have civilians, requesting clarification on rules of engagement." The silence lasted 3 seconds. Then Thorne's voice, coming across 20 light-years through quantum entanglement. "All Zorvath in military installations are valid targets, Lieutenant. Complete your mission." Torres stared at the Zorvath workers. They were not warriors. They did not even carry weapons. But they were in a military installation, and the doctrine was clear. Leave no witnesses who could report human capabilities. Leave no one who could rebuild what humanity was destroying. "Acknowledged," Torres said, and he cut the audio feed before giving the order to his squad. Afterward, sitting alone in the transport back to the Indomitable, Torres looked at his hands. They were steady. That was what terrified him most. He had just ordered the execution of 40 unarmed beings, and his hands did not shake. Thorne reviewed the mission reports each night, reading every casualty figure, every tactical summary, every after-action assessment. He was particularly careful to note the civilian casualties, even though the official policy was that anyone supporting the Zorvath military infrastructure was a legitimate target. He wanted to remember the cost, wanted to ensure he never forgot what he was doing. Commander Volkov found him in his quarters one night, 3 months into the campaign, staring at a holographic display showing the Zorvath world's humanity had neutralized. 32 systems, 89 military installations. Estimated enemy combatant casualties, 400,000. Estimated civilian casualties, unknown but significant, Sir, Volkov said quietly, standing in the doorway. Intelligence reports that the Zorvath are mobilizing their reserve fleet for a final assault. Target is New Harmony. They are planning a suicide run with every ship they have left. Expected casualties, Thorne asked, not looking away from the display. If they reach the planet, millions. Our orbital defense grid can stop most of them, but the projections suggest 5 to 10 ships might break through. Thorne was silent for a long moment. Then, pull back the orbital defense platforms in Sector 7. Create a gap in the coverage. Volkov's face went pale. "Sir, that would allow them. I know what it would allow," Thorne interrupted. "Do it." 3 days later, the Zorvath launched their final assault. Commander Krath'zul had staked everything on this attack, gambling that overwhelming numbers could succeed where strategy had failed. He sent 300 ships crewed by zealots and desperate warriors, all of them knowing they would not return, all of them determined to hurt the humans badly enough to make them stop. The Zorvath fleet entered the New Harmony system and found the human defense platforms falling back, creating openings in the orbital defense grid. To Krath'zul, watching from Zorvath Prime, it looked like victory. The humans were overwhelmed, their defenses collapsing. The Zorvath fleet charged through the gap in Sector 7. Thorne had been waiting. The bulk of the human fleet materialized from stealth positions, having used the gap as bait to draw the Zorvath into a kill zone. Automated drone swarms, thousands of them, each no larger than a human fist, tore through the Zorvath formation like schools of mechanical piranhas. The mining lasers that Dmitry Volkov had weaponized opened fire, their coherent beams slicing capital ships in half. The gravity manipulation systems created localized singularities that crushed entire squadrons into points of infinite density. The battle lasted 11 minutes. The Zorvath fleet was annihilated almost completely. Almost. 3 ships broke through. 3 ships whose crews had sacrificed everything for this moment, who had watched their entire fleet die around them but pressed forward anyway. They crashed into the southern continent of New Harmony, their hulls breaching containment, their fusion cores detonating, their kinetic energy releasing megatons of destructive force. 400,000 humans died instantly. Another million were injured. The city of New Promise was simply erased from existence, leaving a crater 40 kilometers wide still glowing with residual heat. Thorne received the casualty reports on the bridge of the Indomitable. He read them without expression, his face a mask that revealed nothing. Then he turned to Volkov. Change of operational parameters. We are no longer targeting only military installations. Target all Zorvath advanced infrastructure. Communications, power generation, manufacturing, research facilities. Anything above industrial-age technology. Leave the populations alive but remove their ability to wage war for the next 1,000 years. Volkov stared at him. Sir, that is essentially reducing them to a pre-spaceflight civilization. The Council will call it genocide of culture, even if we leave the populations intact. The Council can call it whatever they want, Thorne said quietly. We gave the Zorvath restraint. We gave them mercy. They responded by killing 400,000 civilians who were trying to live in peace. So now they learn what happens when humanity stops being restrained. But Volkov had been watching Thorne carefully for weeks now, and he saw something that made his blood run cold. The Admiral's hands did not shake when he gave the order. His voice did not waver. And in his eyes was a look that Volkov recognized from his own reflection after the Marine operations, the terrible calm of someone who had discovered they could do monstrous things without flinching. Sir, Volkov said carefully, did you know they would break through? Did you create that gap knowing some ships would reach the surface? Thorne met his gaze. We needed the Council to accept what comes next. We needed our own people to accept it. 400,000 was the down payment on humanity's future security. The Zorvath needed to prove themselves irredeemable, and our people needed to see that restraint had failed completely. Do you understand, Commander? Volkov understood. He understood that Admiral Marcus Thorne had sacrificed 400,000 human lives to justify the complete dismantling of Zorvath civilization. He understood that the attack on New Harmony had not been a failure of defense, but a calculated atrocity allowed to happen. He understood that the man giving orders from the Indomitable's bridge was no longer entirely human in any way that mattered. And he understood that he would say nothing, because Thorne was right about the strategic necessity. That realization kept Volkov awake for the rest of the campaign. The Nanites that Nakamura had designed with such horror were deployed across every Zorvath system simultaneously. But these were different Nanites, programmed not to attack living tissue but to infiltrate and disable technology. They spread through computer systems, through power grids, through communication networks. They were invisible, unstoppable, and utterly thorough. Across 47 Zorvath worlds, advanced civilization simply stopped working. Power plants shut down. Computers went dark. Ships became inert metal shells. Communication networks went silent. The Zorvath Dominion, which had terrorized a dozen species for 5 centuries, was reduced to darkness in a single coordinated strike that lasted 6 hours. On Zorvath Prime, a mother named Sheskra watched her child's medical pod lose power. The child survived. The pod's emergency protocols transferred him to manual life support that required no electricity. But the terror of those moments when the lights went out and the machine stopped humming would haunt Sheskra for the rest of her life. She had never threatened humanity. She had never supported the military campaigns. She was a geneticist studying crop adaptation, and now her laboratory was dark, her research gone, her life's work erased. Thorne received reports of incidents like this. Thousands of them. Zorvath civilians whose lives were upended, whose futures were stolen, whose only crime was being born into a militaristic society. He read each report carefully, and he felt the weight of them settling on his shoulders like layers of stone. But he did not countermand his orders. General Mbatha had warned him, "Watch yourself." He was watching. He was seeing exactly what he was becoming. He simply no longer cared enough to stop. The capture of Krath'zul was almost anticlimactic. Human special forces found him in the command center on Zorvath Prime, trying to manually restart systems that would never function again. His guards' weapons did not work. The doors did not lock. The communication systems that might have called for help were silent. They brought him to the indomitable in restraints, though Krath'zul walked with his head high. He was defeated but not broken, and when he entered the observation room where Thorne waited, his vertical pupils fixed on the Admiral with something like respect. "You won," Krath'zul said without preamble. His translator still worked. It was a simple mechanical device, pre-electronic in design, but you revealed yourselves. Every species in the galaxy now knows what you are capable of. They knew what we were capable of, Thorne replied. They just forgot, or they chose not to believe. Krath'zul made a sound that might have been a laugh. "No, human, you forgot. For 3 centuries you played at being peaceful and you convinced yourselves it was your nature. But nature does not change so easily. You are what you always were, apex predators from a death world, cleverer and more vicious than anything else that evolved on your planet. You simply chose to hide it, and we forced you to remember." Thorne studied the Zorvath commander. Krath'zul was intelligent, far more so than the propaganda had suggested. He understood strategy and psychology. He had not lost because he was stupid or weak. He had lost because the Zorvath worldview could not accommodate the concept of chosen restraint. "My people come from a high-gravity world where only the ruthless survived," Krath'zul continued. "Mercy was weakness on Zorvath Prime because the merciful died and left no offspring. We learned the lessons our world taught us." "But you," Thorne stared at him. "You come from a world that taught the same lessons, yet you chose to ignore them. That is not strength. That is denial." "Perhaps," Thorne said quietly, "or perhaps it is strength of a different kind. The strength to choose what you become rather than accepting what evolution made you." "Words," Krath'zul hissed. "Philosophy. It changes nothing. You prove that when threatened you revert to type. You prove the Zorvath right." The silence stretched between them, heavy with implications neither wanted to examine too closely. The tattoo they burned into Krath'zul's chest read, "Mercy is not weakness. It is a choice the strong make." But as the Zorvath commander stood under the laser etcher, feeling the pain of the inscription being burned into his scales, he smiled. "You think this marks me as defeated," he said to Thorne. "It marks you as changed. Every time you look at me, every time anyone mentions what you did here, you will remember that you had to prove you were dangerous. You will remember that you sacrificed your ideals to save your species, and you will never be able to return to what you were before." When Krath'zul was released back to Zorvath Prime, standing in the ruins of his command center with that message burned into his flesh, he looked up at stars he could no longer reach and felt something he had never experienced before: victory in defeat. The Zorvath had lost the war, but they had won something more important. They had made humanity reveal itself. The Galactic Council's emergency session was the most well-attended in its history. Ambassador James Corville stood at the podium where Keiko Tanaka had stood so many times before, and he delivered the speech that had been prepared for him by the civilian government. He spoke of humanity's commitment to peace, of the temporary necessity of violence, of the intention to return to Protocol Sanctuary now that the threat had been neutralized. He said all the right words, hit all the correct notes of diplomatic reconciliation, and every species in the chamber knew he was lying. Afterward, Korval stood alone in the observation gallery reserved for diplomats, watching ships come and go through the docking arrays. A presence materialized beside him, luminous thought in stillness, the Elysian representative whose species was composed of organized light and quantum probability. The Elysians perceived reality differently than corporeal species, existing partially outside linear time. They saw possibilities and potentials, and right now, Luminous was perceiving something that troubled them deeply. "You do not believe what you just said," Luminous observed, their form pulsing with distressed cyan frequencies. Korval laughed bitterly. "No, I think we proved the Zorvath right. Mercy was weakness, violence works. And that is going to poison everything we built for 3 centuries. Then why return to Protocol Sanctuary at all? Why not accept what you have become?" "Because if we do not try," Korval said quietly, "we have already lost. Maybe mercy is just elaborate self-deception. Maybe we are just predators in diplomats' clothing. But the attempt to be better than our nature, even if it fails, even if it is ultimately futile, that attempt is the only thing that makes us worth saving." Luminous pulsed through several colors, processing this. The Elysians, being energy-based life that had never known scarcity or violence, struggled to understand species shaped by harsher evolutionary pressures. But they tried, and that trying was its own form of mercy. "What will Admiral Thorne do now?" Luminous asked. Korval had no answer. Thorne stood on the bridge of the Indomitable, watching the quarantine zone around Zorvath space. Engineering teams were removing the weapon systems he had deployed, replacing them with the non-lethal equipment of Protocol Sanctuary. The process would take months. The ships being retrofitted would never be quite the same. There were structural modifications that could not be easily reversed, weapon ports that would remain even if the weapons themselves were removed. The fleet would always carry the ghost of what it had been. Commander Volkov approached with a report. "Sir, activity detected on Zorvath Prime. They are rebuilding using pre-industrial methods. Current projections suggest it will take them 15 to 20 generations to reach spaceflight capability again." Thorne nodded. "They have time to learn then." "Do you think they will, sir? Learn, I mean." Thorne thought about Krath'zul, about their final conversation, about the way the Zorvath commander had smiled when receiving his tattoo. They learned that mercy is not weakness. Whether they learn mercy itself, that is their choice now, just as it was always our choice. A priority communication alert interrupted them. The Elysian Coalition was requesting human assistance with a humanitarian crisis in their outer territories. The message was carefully worded, respectful, acknowledging that humanity was doing them a favor rather than fulfilling an obligation. The galaxy had learned to make requests rather than assumptions. "Authorize the response," Thorne said. "Medical ships and supply vessels only. No military escort unless specifically requested." Volkov hesitated. "Sir, are you certain we should resume humanitarian operations so soon? Some species might see it as weakness again." Thorne's smile was cold. "They have seen what we do when provoked. Now they get to see what we do when we choose not to be provoked. Let them worry about which is more frightening." Below them, in the medical bay, Dr. Nakamura sat alone in her laboratory, staring at the containment field that held her nanites. She had designed them to save lives, then modified them to take lives, and now they were being converted back to their original medical purpose. But she could never unsee what she had done, could never forget the reports of Zorvath warriors drowning in their own dissolved tissues, could never unhear the screams from the audio recordings that intelligence had recovered. She had saved millions of lives over her career. She had killed hundreds of thousands in 6 months. The mathematics of her existence no longer balanced. A young researcher, Dr. Amara Osai, found her there. Osai had weaponized gravity manipulation, turning stellar engineering into crushing singularities. They did not speak at first, simply sat together in the silence of shared guilt. "Do you regret it?" Osai finally asked. Nakamura considered the question carefully. "I regret that it was necessary. I regret that the galaxy forced us to become this. But do I regret doing it? No. Because the alternative was watching my species die while clutching my principles. That is what terrifies me, Osai said quietly. That I feel the same way. That I would do it again if necessary. What does that make us? Human, Nakamura replied. Just human. On Earth, in the veterans' hospitals that were rapidly filling beyond capacity, soldiers grappled with what they had done. Lieutenant Torres sat in a therapy session, staring at his hands, and tried to explain to a counselor who had never left Earth what it felt like to execute unarmed civilians on the orders of his superiors. They were not soldiers, he said. They were just people trying to survive. And I killed them because a voice on the comm told me they were valid targets. Were they valid targets? The counselor asked carefully. Under the rules of engagement as you understood them. Yes. Tor's hands curled into fists. But that is the problem, is it not? We can make anything valid if we define the rules correctly. We can justify anything if the threat is great enough. Where is the line? When do we become the monsters we are fighting? The counselor had no answer. Nobody did. Across human space, societies fractured under the weight of what their military had done in their name. Some worlds celebrated the victory, calling for the fleet to remain militarized, arguing that the galaxy only respected strength. Other worlds protested, demanding that everyone involved in the campaign be tried for war crimes, insisting that humanity had betrayed its founding principles. The unified government that had spoken with one voice for 3 centuries found itself shouting over internal divisions that threatened to tear it apart. General Mbatha watched it all from her office beneath Earth's surface, and she was not surprised. She had seen this before during Earth's unification wars. She had watched humanity nearly destroy itself debating the ethics of survival. They had learned, eventually, that survival had no ethics, only costs. But costs had to be paid, and the bill was coming due. The final transmission from Zorvath Prime came 5 months after the campaign ended. It was not an official communication, not routed through diplomatic channels. It was simply a video broadcast on open frequencies, ensuring anyone could receive it. Krath'zul stood in what had once been the command center, now a ruin of silent machinery and darkened screens. His scales had dulled with age and stress, but his eyes were sharp as he stared into the camera. Behind him, young Zorvath, hatchlings by their size, watched their leader with the intensity of those learning history. "I am Supreme Commander Krath'zul," he began, his translator rendering his words into galactic standard. "I led the Dominion in war against humanity. I rejected their peace. I murdered their diplomats. I believed their mercy was weakness." He pulled aside his chest armor, revealing the tattoo burned into his scales. "This is what I learned. The humans say mercy is a choice the strong make. I thought this was their justification, their attempt to frame defeat as victory. I was wrong." Krath'zul gestured to the dead technology around him. Humanity had the capacity to annihilate us. They possessed weapons that could have sterilized every Zorvath world in hours. They could have made our species extinct, and they had justification to do so. We killed their people. We tortured their diplomats. We declared our intention to destroy them utterly. He paused, letting that sink in. They stopped. They could have finished us, but they stopped. Not because they were unable to continue. We know now that they were never even approaching their full capacity. They stopped because they chose to stop, because the goal was never to become what we are. The goal was to make us understand what we had failed to comprehend for 5 centuries, that the ability to destroy combined with the choice not to is the ultimate expression of strength. The camera moved closer, focusing on Krath'zul's face. "So I tell the galaxy this, and I tell my own people. We lost the war, but humanity lost something too. They lost their innocence. They lost their ability to believe their own mythology of peaceful exploration. They proved they could be as brutal and efficient as any predator species in the galaxy, and that knowledge will haunt them forever. We forced them to become monsters to survive, and that is our victory in defeat." He touched his tattooed chest, but it is a hollow victory. "Because now we must rebuild our civilization knowing that we were crushed by a species that was not even trying for 3 centuries. We must live knowing that humanity's restraint was not inability but active choice, maintained every single day, in every single interaction. And we must ask ourselves, what does it say about us that we could not recognize that choice for what it was? The transmission ended. Thorne watched it from the Indomitable, standing alone on the bridge during the night cycle when the crew was minimal. Krath'zul's words echoed in the empty space, and Thorne found he had no rebuttal. The Zorvath commander was right about almost everything. They had lost their innocence. They could never return to believing their own mythology. The weapons being removed from the fleet would remain in storage, ready for deployment, and everyone knew it. Protocol sanctuary was no longer a principle, it was a policy, subject to change when circumstances required. And circumstances could be defined however leadership chose to define them. Behind him, the bridge doors opened. General Mbatha entered, ancient and tired, moving slowly but with purpose. She stood beside Thorne, and together they watched the stars in silence. Was it worth it? Thorne finally asked. Everything we gave up, everything we became, was securing our survival worth the cost? Mbatha's answer was slow in coming. I have killed enough people to fill a city. I helped build Protocol Sanctuary because I believed humanity could be better than its nature. I believed we could choose mercy without sacrificing security. And now I know that belief was always half-truth. We can choose mercy, but only from a position of strength. And maintaining that strength requires us to remain capable of terrible things. The question is not whether we are capable of darkness. All species are. The question is whether we can remain capable of darkness while choosing light. Can we? Thorne pressed. Mbatha turned to look at him, her eyes carrying the weight of 9 decades. I do not know, but the attempt is all that separates us from the Zorvath. They never tried. We tried for 3 centuries, failed for 6 months, and now we must try again, knowing it might fail again. That is the burden of being strong enough to choose. 6 months later, the Indomitable completed its retrofit and returned to standard patrol duties along human borders. The quantum disruptors and causality mines were gone, replaced by non-lethal deterrent systems. The automated drone swarms were reprogrammed for rescue operations. The medical nanites were restored to their original purpose, saving lives in human hospitals across 100 worlds. But the schematics remained in secure databases. The scientists who had weaponized civilian technology remained employed, their expertise retained. The soldiers who had executed the campaign received medals and therapy in equal measure, neither sufficient for what they carried. And Thorne stood on the bridge, watching the darkness between stars, knowing that humanity had proven it could be monsters while desperately hoping they would never need to prove it again. The galaxy was safer now, more stable, but colder. Other species gave human space a wide berth, their respect laced with fear, their cooperation motivated by caution rather than genuine partnership. Humanity had won its war, but the victory tasted like ash, and the cost was measured not in casualties but in something far more precious: the ability to believe they were better than their worst impulses. They had shown mercy could coexist with strength. But they had also shown that mercy's limits were frighteningly easy to reach, and that once crossed, the line was nearly impossible to find again. The galaxy had learned its lesson. Now humanity would spend generations learning theirs, that proving you are not weak and proving you are right are 2 entirely different achievements, and that the former, while necessary, might come at the cost of the latter. In the darkness of space, the Indomitable sailed on, its weapons deactivated but ready, its crew trained for peace but capable of war, its captain haunted by the knowledge that he had saved his species by becoming everything they had spent 3 centuries trying not to be. And somewhere in that darkness, on worlds reduced to pre-industrial darkness, the Zorvath rebuilt and remembered, carrying their own scars, learning their own lessons about the price of mistaking choices for limitations. 2 species, forever changed by the moment when mercy ended and violence began, both hoping they would never reach that moment again, both knowing they had lost the innocence required to believe such hope was anything more than wishful thinking. The stars watched in their eternal silence. indifferent to the struggles of those who moved beneath them, and the galaxy settled into an uneasy equilibrium. 3 years after the Zorvath campaign, Ambassador James Corville stood once again at the podium of the Galactic Council, but this time the chamber was different. Quieter, more careful. The representatives who had once dismissed human diplomatic efforts with polite condescension now listened, with the intensity of those who understood that words from humans carried weight beyond their meaning. Corville was proposing a new treaty framework, one that would establish protocols for species experiencing rapid technological advancement. It was reasonable, measured, exactly the kind of legislation that Keiko Tanaka would have proposed. But where Tanaka's words had been met with interest and eventual approval, Corville's were met with immediate acceptance. No debate, no amendments. No species wanted to be seen opposing human diplomatic initiatives. Luminous thought in stillness pulsed with troubled violet frequencies as the vote concluded unanimously. They found Corville afterward in the diplomatic quarter, manifesting in his office as a gentle glow that cast no shadows. They agree with you because they fear you, Luminous observed, not because they believe in your proposal. Corville poured himself a drink, something he had been doing more frequently lately. I know. Tanaka spent 20 years building coalitions through persuasion and compromise. I spend 20 minutes presenting proposals that are accepted immediately because no one wants to risk offending us. This is not diplomacy. It is compliance. Is that not more efficient? Luminous asked, genuinely curious. Your goals are achieved faster. Efficiency is not the same as success. Corville stared into his glass, watching the liquid catch the light of Luminous's form. Tanaka built something real. Relationships based on mutual respect and understanding. I am managing something hollow. Agreements built on fear that will collapse the moment they sense weakness. Then show them you are not to be feared, Luminous suggested. Return to the methods that built trust. Corville's laugh was bitter. We cannot return. That is what Krath'zul understood, and we are still learning. You cannot unring the bell, cannot unsee what has been revealed. The galaxy knows what we are capable of now, and every peaceful gesture will be viewed through that lens. Are we offering aid because we are generous or because we want to maintain influence? Are we proposing treaties because we believe in cooperation or because we are manipulating the political landscape? Intent no longer matters when everyone assumes the worst. On the Indomitable, now 5 years into its post-campaign operations, the crew had changed. Not in composition. Most of the original personnel remained, but in character. They were more efficient, more professional, more capable than before. They were also quieter, carrying themselves with a guardedness that had not existed during the peaceful centuries of exploration. Commander Pavel Volkov had been promoted to executive officer, second only to Thorne in the ship's hierarchy. He stood in the observation deck during his off-shift, watching human colony worlds drift past on the long-range displays, and tried to remember what it felt like to see those lights and think of them as homes rather than strategic assets requiring protection. A young ensign, fresh from the academy, approached him hesitantly. Her name was Lieutenant Kira Nakamura, and yes, she was related, Dr. Yuki Nakamura's niece, though she rarely mentioned it. Sir, Nakamura said carefully, I wanted to ask about the campaign. They teach it at the academy now, but the instructors only cover the tactical aspects. They do not talk about what it was like. Volkov turned to look at her, seeing in her eager face the same expression he remembered wearing a decade ago. Bright with purpose, confident that right and wrong were clearly delineated, certain that military service meant protecting the innocent. What do you want to know? He asked quietly. Did we do the right thing? She asked it simply, as if the question had a simple answer. The Zorvath threatened our existence. We neutralized the threat. But the way we talk about it, the way the instructors avoid discussing details, it feels like we are ashamed. We should be ashamed, Volkov said, his voice flat. We should carry what we did for the rest of our lives and let it weigh on us. That is the price of survival, Lieutenant. We did what was necessary, and necessary things can still be monstrous. Both can be true simultaneously. Nakamura frowned, processing this. But if it was necessary, necessary does not mean right. It means unavoidable given the circumstances we allowed to develop. We spent 3 centuries trying to prove that mercy was not weakness, and when the Zorvath refused to learn that lesson, we had to teach them through violence. But that teaching required us to become teachers of violence, and you cannot teach violence without violence changing you in return. He gestured to the colony worlds on the display. Every light out there represents billions of humans who are alive because we did what we did. That is the justification. But justification is not the same as absolution. We saved our species by proving we could be as brutal as any predator in the galaxy, and now we have to live knowing that about ourselves. Your aunt created machines that dissolved living tissue. I gave orders that killed civilians. Admiral Thorne sacrificed 400,000 of our own people to maintain strategic necessity. We did these things, they worked, and we are all diminished by their success. Nakamura was silent for a long moment. At the academy, they say you are heroes. Volkov's smile was sad. Heroes do not have nightmares about their victories, Lieutenant. Heroes do not stand in observation decks during off-shifts trying to remember what it felt like to believe they were the good people. We are survivors. We are protectors. We are effective. But we are not heroes. On Earth, in the sprawling government complex that coordinated human civilization, debates raged about the future of military policy. Chancellor Yuki Osai, no relation to Dr. Amara Osai, though the name coincidence caused occasional confusion, presided over sessions that grew more contentious with each passing month. The Consolidation Party argued that humanity should maintain full military readiness, that the Zorvath campaign proved the galaxy only respected strength, that Protocol Sanctuary had been a naive experiment that nearly led to extinction. They wanted the weapons kept accessible, the fleet maintained in combat-ready status, military research expanded. The Reconciliation Party countered that humanity's soul was not worth trading for security, that they had become the very thing they had spent centuries opposing, that the path forward required doubling down on diplomatic solutions rather than abandoning them. They wanted the weapons destroyed, not just stored, and military capabilities reduced to pure defensive measures. Chancellor Os listened to both sides and found truth in arguments she wished were false. The galaxy had proven to be more dangerous than humanity's idealism had acknowledged. But humanity had also proven capable of atrocities when threatened, and that capability was now part of their identity whether they liked it or not. The compromise she eventually brokered satisfied no one, which suggested it was probably correct. Maintain Protocol Sanctuary as standard policy, but retain full military capabilities in reserve, accessible only through unanimous approval of the Joint Command Council plus civilian government. It was a policy of armed restraint, mercy backed by the known capacity for overwhelming violence. It was also a policy that required eternal vigilance, constant choice, and the acceptance that humanity would forever exist in the tension between what they wished to be and what they could become. In the veterans' hospitals, the psychological casualties of the Zorvath campaign continued to accumulate. Lieutenant Jamal Torres sat in his 10th therapy session, still trying to articulate what he felt about executing those 40 Zorvath civilians on Station 7. I think about their families, he told the counselor, a patient woman named Dr. Amira Hassan who specialized in combat trauma. I think about whether they had children waiting for them to come home, whether they knew why they were dying, whether they understood that they were being killed not because of what they did but because of where they worked. Dr. Hassan nodded, taking notes. And how does thinking about that make you feel? Like a murderer, Torres said bluntly. Which is accurate, so at least I am being honest with myself. The military says I followed lawful orders. The government says I protected humanity. My citations say I performed my duties with distinction. But none of that changes the fact that I killed people who were not threats, who were not even capable of threatening me, because a voice on a comm told me it was necessary. Do you think it was necessary? Hassan asked. Torres was quiet for a long time. That is the question that keeps me awake, he finally said. Because yes, strategically, leaving witnesses who could report human capabilities would have compromised the entire operation. Yes, Allowing the Zorvath to rebuild their infrastructure would have required us to fight them again in a generation. Yes, every decision made sense within the logic of winning the war quickly and decisively. But necessity and morality are not the same thing, and I am not sure I can live in a universe where they are completely separate. Hassan set down her notes. What would help you live in that universe? Punishment, Torres said immediately. Acknowledgement that what we did was wrong even if it was necessary. Some kind of consequences beyond medals and therapy. Because if there are no consequences, then we are saying that anything is acceptable if the threat is large enough, and that cannot be true. That cannot be what we are. But there were no consequences beyond the internal ones, because humanity's survival had depended on people like Torres doing exactly what they did, and punishing them would have been both hypocritical and strategically foolish. So Torres and thousands like him carried their guilt privately, forever marked by actions that had saved their species while damaging their souls. Dr. Yuki Nakamura published a paper 7 years after the campaign, a detailed technical analysis of the weaponized nanites she had created. But the paper was not a blueprint. It was a warning. She documented every stage of the modification process, every ethical boundary she had crossed, every decision point where she could have refused but chose to continue. She published it in every major scientific journal, ensuring that any species researching similar technology would understand the ease with which healing could become harm. The response was divided. Some called her irresponsible for publicizing the methodology. Others called her brave for refusing to hide behind classification and secrecy. But what struck most readers was the final section, where she wrote, "I am writing this paper because I believe the greatest danger is not that others will learn what I did, but that they will believe it was unique to me, to humanity, to our specific circumstances. It was not. The capability to convert beneficial technology into weapons exists in every field of advanced research. The only thing preventing widespread weaponization is the choice not to weaponize. That choice must be made actively, repeatedly, every single day, by every researcher and every government funding research. The moment we forget that the choice exists, the moment we believe our technology is inherently peaceful because we designed it for peaceful purposes, we have already lost. I created weapons from medical technology because I stopped seeing the choice. Let my failure be your lesson." The paper became required reading in scientific programs across human space and beyond. It won no awards. The content was too disturbing, but it influenced a generation of researchers who understood that their work existed in a moral context that extended far beyond their laboratories. Admiral Marcus Thorne remained in command of the Indomitable for another decade, but he changed in ways that were visible to anyone who had known him before the campaign. He became more distant, more reserved, more willing to accept solitude than companionship. He never married, never developed close friendships outside the military, never allowed himself the luxury of believing he was anything other than a necessary evil. On his 60th birthday, celebrated quietly in his quarters with only Commander Volkov present, he received a message from an unexpected source. It had been transmitted on open channels, routed through multiple systems to obscure its origin, but intelligence confirmed it came from Zorvath Prime. The message was from Krath'zul, now ancient by Zorvath standards, his scales faded to pale crimson, his translator worn but functional. "Admiral Thorne," the message began, Krath'zul's image flickering slightly. "I am told it is customary among your species to mark significant birth dates. I am also told you are 60 years old today, which means you have now spent 10 years living with what you did to my people. I wonder if that is sufficient time for you to understand what I understood when you released me." The image of Krath'zul shifted, showing him standing in what appeared to be a school on Zorvath Prime. Young Zorvath sat in rows, listening to their elder speak. "I teach now," Krath'zul continued. "I teach the hatchlings about the war, about humanity, about the lesson we learned. But I also teach them something you may not have intended. I teach them that the universe is full of species who believe their own narratives, who convince themselves they are peaceful or warlike or honorable or practical, and that all of these narratives are simply stories we tell to avoid confronting what we actually are. He touched the tattoo on his chest, still visible through his faded scales. You marked me with the lesson you wanted me to learn, but here is the lesson I learned instead. There is no such thing as a peaceful species or a warlike species. There are only species making choices, and those choices are contingent on circumstances. You chose peace when peace was possible. You chose war when war was necessary. And now you choose to live with the memory of both, which is perhaps the hardest choice of all. Krath'zul's expression was unreadable, his vertical pupils fixed on the camera. So on your birthday, Admiral, I offer you this, the knowledge that you were right about mercy being a choice. But I also offer you the burden of knowing that you taught the entire galaxy the cost of making that choice badly. The Zorvath made mercy impossible through our brutality. Humanity made mercy questionable through their response to that brutality. And now all of us must live in a universe where mercy exists, but it exists alongside the knowledge that it can end at any moment, for reasons that seem justified at the time and monstrous in retrospect. The message ended with Krath'zul performing a gesture that Thorne had learned was a Zorvath sign of respect between warriors who had tested each other and found both strong. Thorne watched the message 3 times before finally responding. His message was brief. Commander Krath'zul, thank you for your perspective. You are correct that we must all live with what we learned. I hope the next generation, both yours and mine, finds a better way, but I am not confident they will. Perhaps that is the curse of survival. It teaches lessons we wish we had never needed to learn. Be well. He sent the message and then sat in his quarters for a long time, thinking about choices and consequences, about necessity and morality, about the difference between being right and being righteous. Volkov found him there hours later, staring out the viewport at the stars. Sir, Volkov said quietly, the shift is ending. You should rest. Tell me something, Pavel, Thorne said without turning. If you could go back knowing what you know now, would you give the same orders? Volkov did not answer immediately. It was a question he had asked himself countless times, always reaching the same unsatisfying conclusion. Yes, he finally said, because the alternative was worse, but I would hate myself for it just as I hate myself now. Thorne nodded slowly. That is the answer I keep reaching to. We did what we had to do. We protected our species. We were effective. And we will carry that effectiveness like a scar for the rest of our lives, a permanent reminder that survival sometimes requires becoming what you despise. Is there any redemption in that? Volkov asked. I do not know, Thorne admitted. But I think the fact that we are asking the question means we have not completely lost ourselves. Krath'zul was right. We could have become what the Zorvath were, believing that might makes right, that strength justifies any action. But we chose to return to protocol sanctuary, even knowing it was now a choice rather than a principle. That has to count for something. Does it? Volkov pressed. Count for something. Thorne finally turned to look at his executive officer, his oldest friend, the man who had stood beside him through the entire campaign and its aftermath. Ask me again in 50 years, Thorne said quietly. If humanity still chooses mercy when it is easier to choose violence, if we still value restraint when the galaxy fears our lack of restraint, if we still try to be better than our worst impulses, then yes, it counts for something. But we are too close to it now. We are still living in the shadow of what we did. History will judge whether we managed to be both strong and good, or whether we simply prove that the two are incompatible. 20 years after the Zorvath campaign, the galaxy had settled into a new equilibrium. Trade routes functioned efficiently. Diplomatic disputes were resolved through negotiation. Military conflicts were rare and quickly contained. It was, by all objective measures, the most peaceful era in galactic history. But it was a cold peace, maintained not through genuine cooperation but through careful calculation. Species measured their actions against potential human response. The Galactic Council made decisions with one eye on how humanity would react, and humanity itself existed in a state of armed restraint, forever balancing between the mercy they aspired to and the violence they had proven capable of. The Zorvath, now approaching the technological level of early industrial civilization, remained quarantined but alive. Their populations had survived, their culture had adapted, and their new generations grew up learning about the war as distant history rather than lived experience. They would reach space again eventually, but they would reach it changed, forever marked by the knowledge of what happened when they mistook mercy for weakness. And humanity continued its patrols, its diplomatic missions, its humanitarian operations. They helped species in need mediated conflicts, contributed to galactic stability. But everyone knew, humanity knew, the galaxy knew, that beneath the peaceful exterior was a species capable of devastating violence when threatened. The weapons remained in storage. The scientists who had weaponized civilian technology remained available. The soldiers who had fought the campaign remained in service, training new generations in tactics that were never supposed to be used but were always ready. It was mercy, but it was mercy backed by the memory of what happened when mercy failed. It was peace, but it was peace maintained by the fear of war. It was exactly what Keiko Tanaka had died trying to prevent, and exactly what her death had made necessary. In the end, the lesson the galaxy learned was not that mercy was weakness or that violence was strength. The lesson was that both could be true simultaneously, that the strong could choose mercy while remaining capable of violence, and that this paradox was the foundation of all genuine peace. Not peace based on weakness or fear alone, but peace based on the choice to be peaceful made by those capable of being otherwise. It was an uncomfortable lesson, one that no species truly wanted to learn, because it required accepting that civilization was always one bad decision away from barbarism, that the line between defending and destroying was terrifyingly thin, and that maintaining that line required constant vigilance, constant choice, and constant willingness to live with the knowledge of what you could become. The stars watched in their eternal silence as humanity and the galaxy they had changed continued their careful dance between mercy and violence, hope and fear, the ideals they aspired to and the reality of what survival sometimes required. And somewhere in the darkness of space, Admiral Marcus Thorne stood on the bridge of the Indomitable, now in the final years of his command, and hoped that future generations would find a better way. But he doubted they would, because the universe had proven itself too dangerous for pure idealism and too complex for pure pragmatism, leaving only the uncomfortable middle ground where mercy and violence coexisted in permanent tension. That was the real victory of the Zorvath campaign, though no one celebrated it. Humanity had learned to live in that tension, to make the choice for mercy every single day while knowing they could choose otherwise, to be strong enough to be gentle and wise enough to know when gentleness was no longer possible. It was not the ending anyone had wanted, but it was the ending that survival had required, and they would all have to live with it for as long as their civilizations endured. The galaxy had learned that mercy was not weakness, but it had also learned that proving it was not weakness came at a cost that could never be fully repaid, and that knowledge changed everything forever.